Okay, there we go. All set. Okay, so we talked about structure determining function. Okay. So that's a pretty straightforward theme. How our body, the anatomy determines the physiology. That's kind of how we're approaching this. Our next theme was homeostasis, which is a bit more involved. The structure determining function is fairly straightforward. Homeostasis, like I said, this isn't going to come up in name over and over again. I'm not going to mention homeostasis, but our bodies are constantly trying to control our internal environments and keep us stable. Homeostasis, the term, the etymology of it, the meaning of the word is steady state. So generally our bodies want to stay within this happy range of whatever it may be. Like I said, blood pH, body temperature, whatever it is, blood sugar. Our bodies want to stay within a range. Doesn't mean they stay at an exact point, like exactly 98.6 Fahrenheit. It'll fluctuate a little bit, but within a range. It does not mean, homeostasis doesn't mean constant. So a lot of people think homeostasis means we do stay at exactly a certain temperature or exactly a certain blood pH, but that's not the case. It doesn't mean constant. It means generally a steady state within ranges. So if you've ever had, has anyone had like blood work done? Like you get your blood drawn and you see the results or whatever. Usually they have a normal range, right? And hopefully your number is within that normal range, but that normal range is there because of this idea that we don't stay constant. We're kind of shifting our internal environment constantly, and within that range is fine. If you're outside that range, then it gets, it might be something to worry about, or it might not be. I just had blood work done and some of my white blood cells were up because I've had allergies. So allergies a lot of times can throw off one of your white blood cell counts. That's not a huge deal, but there's other things that they can look for where it is a bigger deal if you're outside the normal range. Or I assume it's not a big deal because I haven't gotten a worrying call from my doctor. So there are continual variations and we have these normal ranges. I just said that, sorry. Should have brought up those bullet points. We're continually changing. We don't notice it, which is good. It's a good thing that we don't notice these changes. It would be kind of exhausting thinking about it all the time. Oh, sorry. I went through that quickly. I'll leave that up for a second. I'm going to talk about a couple different kinds of homeostasis. There's two kinds of feedback that you're going to need to know. The first of those is negative feedback. Negative feedback is a lot more common and important in the functioning of our body, I would say, than positive feedback. So I'm going to focus on what negative feedback means first off, and then we'll go into positive feedback in a little bit. So a negative feedback mechanism is basically a homeostatic mechanism, something that keeps our bodies within that tolerance range, where if your body is going to say the temperature is increasing, your body will bring your temperature back down. So the response is in the opposite direction of the stimulus, is the technical way of saying it. So there's a stimulus, say your body temperature is going up. That means you're going to start sweating to bring your body temperature back down. So the response and the stimulus are in opposite directions for negative feedback. And I'll give you some more examples with that. Temperature is the best one. I mean, most common one that we think of. If we get hot, we sweat. If we get cold, we shiver. So we're trying to kind of re-regulate that body temperature through a negative feedback mechanism. Negative just means that opposite direction. The stimulus is in one direction, the response brings the body in the other direction. Blood pressure is another good example. Blood glucose levels, so blood sugar. Those are kind of the main ones. Some of the main systems controlled by this negative feedback homeostatic mechanism. And I think that makes sense to most people, especially with the temperature example. Positive feedback doesn't really contribute to homeostasis. I'm going to leave positive feedback at that right now. I'll talk about what it is in a few slides. But homeostasis is really controlled by these negative feedbacks. When your body gets out of whack, there's systems in place to bring those temperatures, the blood sugar levels back to normal. So negative feedback is really important with homeostasis. Positive feedback, we have positive feedback mechanisms in our body, but they don't contribute to this balance, that keeping us within these normal ranges. And that may not make sense yet, but that's okay. I'll get to it, I promise. I want to talk a little bit more about negative feedback first. So here's an analogy for a negative feedback mechanism. If you think about your house and the thermostat, you have the room temperature set to a certain point. If it falls below that, it kicks the thermostat on and brings the temperature back up, right? Your body is kind of the exact same way. You have an internal thermostat, you have receptors in your body that determine what your internal temperature is. If the temperature goes down, that thermostat will kick on and bring your temperature back up, so it stays within a normal range. Same idea as a thermostat in your house. So that's negative feedback. For our bodies, that usually involves sweating or shivering. So if this is 98.6 is sort of what we call the set point, it's the ideal. But again, we fluctuate around that set point on a daily basis. So if we want to stay within this range, we'll say around 98.6. If the temperature goes up in our body, we'll start sweating. So you can see that response. If our temperature drops too far below that set point, we'll start shivering. And that's what allows us to adjust our temperature. It's really simple. Again, the stimulus is going in one direction, right? Your temperature is going up. So the response is going to bring the temperature back down. That's the negative aspect. Vasodilation and vasoconstriction, we'll get into what those terms are. Sorry guys, on Zoom, I forgot to advance the slide there. So yeah, we'll talk about those terms in a little bit. Don't worry too much about them right now. That's the idea behind negative feedback. Any questions about negative feedback? Yes.
So like when you have a fever and you get like the chills, what is that?
Yeah, good question. So if you get the chills, your body's trying to kind of release heat. I'd have to look into that, exactly why you get chills when you're really hot. I don't know. No, that's a good question. I've never thought about it, because usually I think of, yeah, like sweating, but not when you're sick. If you have a fever, I don't know. I'll look that up. Good question. All right, another example, blood pressure, same idea. If your blood pressure, so has anyone ever like stood up and you feel like woozy and you kind of feel like you don't have enough blood in your head? It's because your blood pressure was low, say when you get out of bed in the morning. You don't need a whole lot of blood pressure because there's not as much gravity pulling all the blood down to your feet as when you're standing, right? It's more evened out. And your heart rate slows down, so you have lower blood pressure typically at night. When you get up really quickly, there's not enough blood in your head, so your nervous system doesn't function quite as well. Your blood pressure kind of drops and it drains to the lower body. So there's this mechanism basically above your heart. There's a couple of receptors that recognize that blood pressure drop, and your body will react in specific ways to bring the blood pressure back up. So it could increase your heart rate, constrict your blood vessels. There's a number of different ways to increase blood pressure. In this case, it's showing accelerated heartbeat. So more blood pumping through the veins or the blood vessels is going to lead to increased blood pressure. So same idea, your blood pressure goes down, the negative mechanism is going to bring your blood pressure back up. So opposite directions. Okay. There's three different kind of pieces to these homeostatic mechanisms. So I've talked about receptors already. We have receptors in our body that recognize when something's off. That's the first part of a homeostatic mechanism. There's basically 3 steps here for creating the response to re-achieve homeostasis. The receptor is some kind of structure. In that previous slide, I showed you there are 2 little kind of stars. There's receptors above your heart that register blood pressure. There's other sensors in your body that register body temperature. The receptor is just the kind of the initial point where your body realizes something's off. Receptor, pretty straightforward. Any kind of receptor is going to take in information. So homeostatic receptors are always reading, say, your blood pressure. So they're reading that information. The second part of this whole process involves the integrating or the control center. This is typically your brain. So your brain makes most of the changes in your body. All of the information is integrated. So the receptor collects the information, so like data collection kind of, and sends it to the integrating or control center. There's different parts of the brain that deal with different systems. So there's a cardiac center of the brain. If your blood pressure changes, that's where the information will be sent to the cardiac center. And that's the part that makes the decision. So the center, the integrating center will make the decision as to what to do. If blood pressure is too low and the receptor sends a message to the integrating center saying, whoa, the blood pressure is low, the brain will make the decision to increase heart rate, to increase blood pressure. So this is the decision-making center of this whole homeostatic system. And then finally, you have an effector, which is whatever is carrying out the change. So the heart, in this case, that would be the organ that will increase its rate in order to increase blood pressure. So the effector makes the change. The receptor collects data, the integrating center analyzes that data and makes a decision as to what to do, and then it sends a message to the effector, which is the organ that actually makes the change. So the heart, in the case of blood pressure.
So you can call this the three homeostatic mechanisms.
I would call them homeostatic mechanisms, the pieces of a homeostatic mechanism. Yeah. 3 parts. And that kind of makes sense logically, right? Something has to take in data, something has to make a decision, and then something has to carry out that effect. That's the effector. Okay. So if we look at it in kind of a diagram form here, you have some kind of stimulus and then these 3 pieces we just talked about. So a stimulus is going to set off the sensor, the control center, and the effector. So the sensor, I think I had listed as a receptor, sorry. Sensor/receptor, same idea. If we're talking about body temperature, if it goes too high, the sensors are going to be nerve cells in the skin and brain. So your skin realizes it's too hot. That's going to send a message to the temperature regulatory center in the brain. The brain is pretty much always the integrating center. The brain's doing all the decision making. And then the brain will send information out to the sweat glands and say, start sweating, let's release some heat. So that's going to be the effector. So these kind of line up. This is an example using these basic terms. And I will say there's a lot of terms in A&P that there's kind of synonyms. So in this case, this is one example. Sensor is the same as receptor. Just a heads up, if there's something you don't need to know, like if there's a term that I don't really use, I'll tell you, but sensor and receptor are kind of interchangeable. It's unfortunate. It's just been, sometimes there's 2 terms that are used interchangeably very regularly. So if you're going into healthcare, you kind of want to know both of them. Okay. So that's our negative feedback, right? We've been talking about negative feedback the whole time. This process is still these 3 pieces of the homeostatic mechanism are the same for positive feedback. So we still have a sensor, control center, and effector. But in the case of positive feedback, the deviation from the set point gets greater and greater. So here with negative feedback, like I talked about, we're trying to, if the temperature is going up, our temperature is going up, we want to bring it back down. In the case of positive feedback, that stimulus, if it's going up, whatever it might be, positive feedback is going to make it go up even further. So it's going to amplify the effect. which sounds crazy. And that doesn't happen with temperature. That would be bad if it happened with our body temperature or our blood pressure. Now, positive feedback has a place in our body as well. Again, negative feedback is what contributes to homeostasis. Positive feedback is, I'll talk about what it is and some examples, but it doesn't contribute to this rebalancing of our body. Okay, so what's positive feedback? It seems a little bit weird. Like I said, it's a mechanism that's going to intensify a change or amplify that change. And I'll talk about some examples in a minute. But if there's a stimulus going in one direction, a positive feedback cycle is going to make it go even more in that direction. So change in one direction is going to continue on until that change is greater and greater and greater. Again, blood pressure, temperature, the two I've talked about, we don't want that to happen. If our temperature starts to go up, we don't want it to be a positive feedback where our temperature continues to go up. That can cause organ damage. Same with blood pressure. If your blood pressure just keeps going up and up and up, that's a bad thing, right? So that needs to be a negative feedback mechanism. And this is a good way to think about it. Change produces more change in the same direction.
So
Mhm.
I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, it's confusing. So yes.
So
ask.
within the positive feedback, for example, you have a high temperature, okay? And then you're trying to bring it down, but are you saying that it'll keep getting higher and higher?
Temperature doesn't follow a positive feedback mechanism.
Okay, so.
It's only negative.
Could you give another example?
Yep, I'm going to talk about examples of positive feedback. Yes. Temperature and blood pressure, they don't do positive feedback. They do negative.
Okay.
Yes. A great example is childbirth. So positive feedback plays into the whole childbirth process. So uterine contractions. As the uterus is contracting, it sends a message to multiple places. Yeah, exactly. So it'll send a message to the brain to release oxytocin, which makes further uterine contractions. So some uterine contraction will send a message to the brain. The brain will then make it contract even further. So that's change in one direction. You want the uterus to continue to contract, right? You don't want it to contract and then release, contract and release. The baby's never going to come out. So you want further contraction. So that's an excellent example of positive feedback. You need more change in the same direction. You need more contraction, not going back to some set point. So positive feedback, that's a great example of positive feedback. Blood clotting is another one. You don't, if your blood starts to clot, so say you get a cut and your blood clots to protect that cut, you don't want it to then unclot and go back to liquid, right? You want it to continue to clot. So more and more clotting. That's a good example of positive feedback. Nerve signals I won't go into, but that's another example of positive feedback. None of these have anything to do with homeostasis. So childbirth has nothing to do with homeostasis. You're just trying to get a kid out, right? Get the fetus out, get the baby out. That's not homeostasis. Homeostasis is trying to kind of get you back to that set point. So that's why I say positive feedback doesn't, I won't say never, but I can't imagine a case, and I can't think of a case where it contributes to homeostasis. That doesn't mean positive feedback isn't important in human physiology. It is in these cases. But when we're talking about homeostasis, it's all about negative feedback mechanisms. But I want to talk about positive feedback because, you know, that's an obvious opposite of negative. Questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, that's all about homeostasis for now. Now I want to talk about that human structure. So this is our third theme. We talked about structure determining function, homeostasis, and now the general structure of the complexity of an organism. So you can break us all the way down to atoms, right? If you break us down to our simplest elements, we are just a bunch of atoms that are all working together to form us, which is kind of crazy to think about. But you can build it up into a whole organism. So like I said, this is kind of what we're going to be talking about and moving through as we get to organ systems. This is technically, I think the technical term for it is hierarchy of complexity. It's a hierarchy, right? You start with something simple like an atom and build up to a complete human being. The simplest part of us are these atoms. So if we start up at this kind of top of the pyramid, you can break us down into individual atoms. Those atoms come together in one form or another and form cells. So cells are kind of the basic unit of human life, which I'll talk about on the next slide, I think. Cells become, when cells are working together, you get a tissue. Tissue is going to be kind of one of the first really, I would say, difficult chapters and concepts in this class that you probably haven't learned about before, unless you had an A&P class before. So that's histology, talking about how these cells work together to form tissues. So smooth muscle tissue or skeletal muscle, so like your biceps, that's a bunch of cells working together. Those tissues are going to come together to form organs. In this case, they're showing a bladder. Organs will come together to form organ systems. Organ systems, the next step up for us is the whole organism. We are mostly, well, I'm going to talk about chemistry early on because I think most people have had some intro to chemistry, but chemistry isn't a prereq for this class. So I want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. We're just going to be talking about biologically oriented chemistry. So we'll talk about kind of atoms, molecules, and then cells. So we'll go from cells to tissues, spend a lot of time there, and then go into the organ systems. So that's kind of where we're going. And that's why we're going to start out talking about stuff that, like I said, chemistry that doesn't seem like it really has much of a place in anatomy and physiology, but the chemistry is kind of underlying all of this. All of our functionality is dependent on chemistry. I guess. So here I have just kind of another diagram showing this structural hierarchy. I didn't mention molecule or macromolecule in there. You don't really have to worry about that. But atom to, oh, we even have organelles. So there's a bunch of organelles in a cell. We'll talk about those. Cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up whole organ systems. So like your digestive system is a bunch of different organs working together. And then the whole person. So that's going to come up again, probably I'm not going to talk about it specifically, but you'll see us make that progression from atoms to organ systems. I have some definitions here in case that's helpful for you guys. We'll start with the cell. Like I said, we're actually going to start with a little bit of chemistry, but there's not really a definition that I wanted to put up here for chemistry. But the cell is the basic biological unit. Everything that's alive, that we consider alive, is made up of at least one cell. It could just be one cell, like bacteria are single cellular organisms, but they're alive. We have 37 trillion cells in our body, more or less, give or take a few, I guess. So we have a lot of cells. That's going to be the basic unit. And then, as I said before, you kind of build up to tissues, to organ systems. Questions so far? That's pretty straightforward. Okay. Just a basic look at cells. Like I said, we'll get into them. Don't worry about that slide. We're made of cells. We'll get into cells. There are, I guess I could say, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We're not talking about prokaryotes. Those are single-celled organisms. They're bacteria. We are multicellular. We're really complicated. We have a lot of stuff in our cell. We have a lot of organelles that we're going to review and learn about again. We're not going to talk about prokaryotes, really. All right, tissues. Tissues. So like I said, this is the first, what chapter is it? 6. Thank you. I was going to say 5, 6. Chapter 6 is the first chapter that gets really complex, I would say. It's stuff unless you've had A&P before, you probably haven't heard tissues. These are a bunch of cells working together. You can see here. So epithelial tissue is like what your skin is made of. There's a bunch of cells that actually work together and communicate with each other to form that tissue.
It's 5.
Oh, is it 5? Okay, cool. Yeah, 5 or 6. We'll get there. So we're getting into this basic idea of cells working together. That's kind of our next big leap after we get past the chemistry and kind of unicellular stuff. These are the 4 main kinds of tissues. You don't have to worry about them right now. We'll have plenty of time to talk about these 4 main types of tissues. But you have connective tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial, and nervous. You will learn them in lab. You'll learn how to identify them. You'll learn what they do. You'll learn more than you ever wanted to know about tissues. So just a little preview there. And then I'm kind of skipping over organs here, going right into organ systems. So this is from your textbook. I was thinking this was from your lab manual. So there's generally 11 organ systems that we divide the body into. And you can see here, basically the 3 that we cover in A&P 1. So we only cover 3 out of these. The rest are in A&P 2. So there's a lot of organ systems in A&P 2. You just kind of jump right in A&P 2. We don't have kind of the review of cells and chemistry and all of that. So we can cover a few more organ systems. But we're going to be talking about the integumentary system, which is your skin, hair, nails, the nervous system, brain and nerves, and then musculoskeletal. Sometimes this is divided. We're going to divide it into muscular and skeletal, but sometimes it's just lumped into one, musculoskeletal, because they're so closely related. So those are the 3 we're going to cover in detail a little bit further down the road this semester. However, for this class, I want you to have a general idea of what all of these organ systems involve and do. So some of the main organs, and then also the main functions. Some of them are easy. The reproductive system, duh, it's for reproduction. Circulatory system, to pump blood around the body. Endocrine and lymphatic are a little bit more like you've heard of them, but you don't quite know what they are. So I would definitely suggest kind of focusing on when you're studying these. I'm going to ask some pretty basic questions on the exam about an organ from each of these systems or a function of each of these systems, but focus on the ones that you don't quite know how to define. That's what I would suggest. So I'm going to run through each of these. I have a handout that might be helpful for you. This is from another lab manual, but I'm going to go through. For you guys on Zoom, I will post this handout. It's basically just kind of boxes to make notes about the different organ systems as I'm going through them. I apologize, I forgot to post it. We're going to go through each of these kind of briefly. If you don't want to use this, you don't have to. It's just kind of a helpful organizational worksheet, I would say. And I'll kind of point out this, this PowerPoint it has all of the, like pretty much all the organs and functions. We're just going to talk about, I'm going to basically tell you what I will ask about. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. So I'm going to focus on the organs that I'll ask about and then the functions. And we're going to keep it really basic for this time around. I don't think it's in the same order. I apologize, is what I have up here. So it'll be, just make sure you find the correct system. Does this have muscular and skeletal separate? Yeah, okay. So on that previous table, like I said, the muscular and skeletal were lumped together. We're going to talk about them separately. That's kind of our 2 really big, I would say, big focus chapters in this class, the muscles and the skeleton. So they're separated here and thankfully separated on that handout. So integumentary system, hair, skin, and nails. That's going to be one of the first systems we get into. It's pretty easy. There's not a whole lot to it. It's really important, but it's not super complicated, which is really nice. The most important part, it encloses our internal structures. If we didn't have skin, It'd be kind of gross. It helps keep us all together. Oh, maybe it is in the same order. Sweet. Yeah. Okay. So those are the main organs that I'll ask about, and the main function is it encloses our internal components. The skeletal system. What's the main part of the skeletal system? Bones. Bones are organs, which is crazy. We don't think of bones as organs, but they are. They change over time. They have functions. They're not static. They don't stay the same. We basically regrow our skeleton multiple times throughout our lives, which is kind of cool. Bones are the main organ of the skeleton. The skeleton is for structure and movement. I mean, it allows us it's where our muscles attach, right? So mostly for structure. It assists with the muscular system. Otherwise, our muscles wouldn't have anywhere to attach. Okay, muscular system. Muscles are the main organ. There's different kinds of muscle, but just put muscles for now. And the biggest part of the muscular system is that it enables movement. It also says here it helps maintain body temperature, but we're not really going to focus on that aspect of it. It just allows for us to move. Next, the nervous system. What's the main organ of the nervous system? The brain. The brain's the big one. Spinal cord is also huge. So brain and spinal cord are the big pieces of the nervous system. There's a bunch of other nerves, obviously, throughout our body, but for now, brain and spinal cord are our main organs. And what does the nervous system do? What's its whole goal? Anyone? What does your brain do? Yeah, sensory. It thinks, it makes decisions. So it processes and senses. So it senses outside information and it processes it. All right, those are our first four. Any questions about those? Again, keeping it pretty simple to start with. Just have an idea, kind of an overview of these different systems. Reproductive system, we'll just kind of lump those together, especially since we're not getting into it. They have male and female separated. It's the last one on this, the last two on the last page. So reproductive system, sex organs, you can just put generally sex organs. And the purpose is reproduction. Some of these are so simple, it's almost not worth taking notes on. I will say, yeah, the female reproductive system also has the supporting of the embryo, the fetus. That's a pretty major function, I would say, until birth. All right. So reproductive system, we're just gonna lump male and female together. They're obviously pretty different. But we're not gonna worry about the differences in this class. Good. All right, the endocrine system. That's one that people, you've heard of the endocrine system probably. You've heard that term. You don't really know what it is. This is the system that creates and sends hormones around the body. So hormones are basically chemical messengers. So it secretes hormones. Hormones tell different organs what to do. Kind of similar to the nervous system in that way. It'll send messages around the body, but through hormones instead of nerves. Again, that's probably a little too much information, but the endocrine system is kind of one of the underappreciated systems, I would say, in the body. There's some major glands and organs. I would say for our purposes, the major ones are going to be the pancreas. And we'll say thyroid because people are pretty familiar with the idea of the thyroid gland. So pancreas and thyroid are the two big ones I want you to know. For the endocrine system, there's a lot of others. So the endocrine system is very complicated. When you cover it in A&P2, you'll learn a ton of different hormones that are sent throughout the body. The different organs interact and send messages back to each other. It's a mess, but if it functions well, you're in good shape. The thyroid gland can often kind of be a little not function quite as well. So you've probably heard of hyperthyroidism if it's too active, or hypothyroidism if it doesn't do enough. That's all the endocrine system. Cardiovascular. What's the biggest organ you can think of in the cardiovascular system? Heart. Yeah. So the heart is the center of the cardiovascular system. It is the whole purpose of the cardiovascular system is to deliver oxygen, basically move oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients around the body. It's like a shuttle system. Oxygen goes to the organs, carbon dioxide goes away from the organs back to the lungs to be exhaled. Okay, cardiovascular. Class 4. The lymphatic system is another system, like I said, like I mentioned with the endocrine, that kind of gets overlooked. We don't think about the lymphatic system. We don't really know probably what it does, most of us, but it's really important. So the purpose of the lymphatic system is to basically filter and return fluid to the blood. So it takes fluid out of the blood, filters it, puts it back in the blood. It's really important in the immune system. So lymphatic and immune are usually kind of joined together in that table that I showed you. It said lymphatic/immune system because they're so closely interrelated. So the lymphatic system, really important in immunity and filtering of fluids from the blood. Our blood has stuff in it that we don't always want in it, so it'll get it out of there. The main parts of the lymphatic system, lymph nodes, lymphatic vessels. That's pretty easy to remember because they have the lymph name in them. The spleen. Yeah, you should definitely write down the spleen. That's the biggest lymphatic organ. The spleen is really important in the immune system and the immune side of this. All right, the last three are pretty simple. Respiratory for breathing, for gas exchange, bringing oxygen in, releasing carbon dioxide. And obviously, I'd say the lungs are probably the main part of the respiratory system. Yeah, trachea, pharynx and larynx you can include in there. But I'll pretty much only ask about the lungs. If I say what system are the lungs part of, hopefully you can answer respiratory. Okay, digestive, that is to basically digest food, obviously, break down food and extract nutrients. So get nutrients out of our ingested food. There's a ton of organs involved in the digestive system. We'll focus on stomach, small and large intestine. Okay, and then finally, the urinary system. The urinary system is getting rid of nitrogenous wastes. That's the main goal. Nitrogenous wastes are very toxic. So waste with nitrogen in it is really toxic. The urinary system gets rid of that. And it helps balance the water in our body. So if you drink a lot of water and you're too hydrated, you'll pee a lot more. If you are dehydrated, your kidneys will kind of slow down and not process as much fluid, turning it into urine, and you'll pee less. So water balance, getting rid of nitrogenous wastes. The kidneys and the bladder, kidneys and urinary bladder are the main organs for the urinary system. I think that's all of them, right? You fill them all in. Static respiratory cardiovascular. All right, like I said, you don't need to know all detail about all of these systems right now, but having a general idea, because they obviously interact. So that's why we talk about them all at the beginning. I'm going to be referring to them every now and then, even if we don't cover them in here. We'll stop there today and then pick up with something else. Yes, mapping the human body on Friday, which we'll be doing in lab actually. If you've had lab this week, you've already kind of seen this. We'll be talking about this on Friday and some terminology dealing with mapping the human body. See ya. Oh, thanks. Thank you. You too.